بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. It's Sunday night, so we are discussing Raghib al-Asfahani's book Dhariyah ila Makarim Shariah, the path to obtaining the elite qualities that Allah wants for us to have in order to fulfill our role and our highest purpose, which is khilafah, which is being Allah's representative on earth. We talked last class about the ability to change, or the lack thereof. Are we able to change the people we are? And if so, how much are we able to change it? What do you recall from last lesson? Are we able to change who we are? Can we use our nature to justify our poor character? We say, Allah created me this way. I just happen to get angry at X, Y, and Z. When this happens, I yell, I scream. Is our character something that we can change or not? Obviously, with the subject of the book, Raghib al-Asfahani is on a mission to prove that yes, it is something that you can change. And the reason why he is going into it is because this is one of the biggest doubts that the devil tries to utilize and weaponize against us to excuse ourselves from undergoing this project in the first place. The author, Raghib al-Asfahani, he said that human beings are a little bit different from everything else because we come into this world as raw material, unfinished business. We need to be polished. We need to be developed if we're going to fulfill our true potential. That true potential is being Allah's successor or representative, doing what Allah would have us do in the creation, bringing about the qualities that Allah Himself has in His creation, such as generosity, such as mercy, such as nobility, such as justice. So if we're going to get there, to do that work, we have to get these qualities. We have to develop them in ourselves. What's one of the biggest obstacles to that project is to tell ourselves that we can't do it, that we are the way we are, that Allah created us this way, and therefore it's not possible to change ourselves or develop ourselves, to improve ourselves, and thus to kind of disqualify this entire project. So the next chapter, Raghib al-Asfahani, he responds rhetorically, right? Before last class, he was responding logically. He was saying, well, there's this type of Allah's creation which is unchangeable, and this other type which is changeable, and so on and so forth. Now he's going to respond rhetorically to the person who would say that, listen, Allah created me, and He created me in this form, with this character, with these propensities and tendencies. And so who am I to change Allah's creation? What ability do I have to alter it? This is the will of Allah. He says, have you seen such a person as somebody who cuts the grass? Would we just let the grass grow? and the weeds and everything else and claim that we can't do anything about it. Allah created it this way. We can't cut it, we can't shape it, we can't form it. Or someone who prunes trees into a proper shape. Like here in New York, they prune apple trees usually to keep them a certain space apart so that the wind can blow through, and they prune them so that the branches are lower to the ground so it's easy to pick. We apply this logic within our dunya. Why don't we apply it to ourselves? Obviously, there are things within the creation that we are able to change or manipulate, whether those things are changing their outward forms, such as pruning trees, cutting the grass, clipping our fingernails even, giving ourselves a haircut. Or sometimes even we're able to change the nature of things. We boil water and it evaporates into steam. We've changed it at the chemical level, we've broken the bonds, and it dissipates into thin air. We breed certain plants to have certain characteristics. They do this in agriculture all the time. How do you think we get seedless grapes, seedless watermelons and cucumbers, things like this? They don't come like that by themselves. It's human intervention that breeds this variety with that variety in order to achieve certain traits. Even some animals can be domesticated and tamed, such as dogs, cheetahs. In the Arabian Peninsula, they do domesticate cheetahs for hunting, falcons, animals such as horses and oxen that we've relied upon for thousands of years. So if an animal is capable of being domesticated and trained to do work, if you can see in North America, you can train a dog to respond to calls, to jump up in the air, to do these kinds of crazy courses that they do, then you're out of excuses. Then you too can be trained. You too can alter and intervene into your habits and into your practice, into your character. Allah said, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The true person who has succeeded, the real success in this life, isn't the person with the big paycheck, not the person with the big house, not the person who's famous, the star athlete. It's the person who has purified themselves. Zakkaha. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. And so this is our project. Our project is to purify it. Now that's not to say that some people don't have it easier than other people. That's true. You'll find there are people that all you have to do is tell them something once and they can implement it. And they'll never backslide, they'll never go back. And then there's other people that they know better, but it takes them time and time and time again to break the habit that they're in, to break the cycle. Maybe as soon as they start to see some progress, they intervene at the level of habit, and then they find that the very next time they have a setback and they fall back into their old ways. This isn't to say that such a person can't change. It's just that they have to expand more effort. They have to rely upon Allah a little bit more. The important thing is that the slowness of change or the difficulty of change cannot be confused with an inability to change, because we are all capable of it, and the companions are our shining example. They lived on the borderlines between a life of idolatry and a life of tawheed. So if they can do it, we can do it too. The next chapter We'll begin with a question. Well, first of all, we need to do a little bit of review for this question. Recall that Raghib al-Asfahani, when he was talking about the aspects of your nature that you cannot change, we said that he's talking about the three fundamental capacities. The raw material Allah gave us to either develop into the elite qualities He wants us to have, or we can squander them and they can become vice of some sort. What were these three capacities? These three capacities make up the mold that we're created in, and the existence of those capacities we cannot change. That's true. What were these three capacities? Thoughts, yes, that's the first one. Anger, urge. Excellent work. Thought, anger, urge. Good. So his next chapter, he's going to zero in on one of these things, one of these three capacities. The one that he says is the hardest one to tame. Which one of these three capacities do you think is the hardest to master and the hardest to discipline? The Shahada family says anger. Sheikh family says urge. Okay, let's justify our opinions with some reason. Why? For those of you, so we have two for urge and one for anger. For those of you who said urge, why? What makes urge harder to discipline? Go ahead. Mohammed, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I say thought.
Thoughts? Oh, good. Well, mashallah. So we have everyone covered. Good. That's what we want. That's where discussion starts. So now everybody has to justify their opinion. For those of you who said thought, why? What makes thought the hardest one to discipline? For those who said urge, what makes urge the hardest one to discipline? And for those who said anger, you do the same. Okay, so the Sheikh family says they chose urge. They say that humans are weak. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. Allah says it in Surah An-Nisa. And temptations are everywhere. That's very true. We live in a society and a time where we see that every single day. Okay, that's for urge. What about Shahada family? Can you give us an insight into your ta'lil? Why do you think anger is the hardest one to discipline and control? And the Sheikh family is helping you out. They say that anger is the most difficult to control once you're in it, right? I can definitely see that. Okay, we'll see if they have anything else to add. Mohammed, why did you say thought? What makes you think that thought is the most difficult one to control?
I say thought because before anger and urge, you think about it. You know what I mean? It hits like it's like it's that whispers, or you know what I mean. You can't like you know with shaitan, like when it's whispering, it whispers to your heart. You know what I mean? Then 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 it's like how you react to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that's when the reaction you could that's just in your head, but when the anger is coming out is because you are taking action. It happened inside of you. Now you physically reacting to it, but that's something inside of you. You know what I mean? That I just I don't know. I just think
I hear what you're saying. No, that's a good response.
you
So
know
it's
what I mean.
so it's almost like all action has thought as a part of it, and
Yeah.
or like it begins as a thought, just like the author said some lessons ago. I'm not sure if you were with us at that point, but he said basically that it starts as a seed and then it grows and it grows until it becomes an action. So it's almost
Yes.
like the thought is almost the hardest one to tame because that's working at the level of those seeds. I can
Yes.
see that.
Yes.
Okay, Shahada family says, because anger overtakes you, it becomes extremely hard to control that anger and to cool down. All rational thought is out the window. Yes, very good. Well, I think all of your responses indicate that we could make an argument for all of them. We could definitely make, and the arguments that we've brought forth demonstrate that they're all difficult to discipline, right? There's no one of them that is easy to discipline. They all have a degree of difficulty. And I think probably our answers also illustrate that it might be different from person to person. Okay? Some people might have a particular trial when it comes to disciplining their anger. Right. Very good, Sheikh family. Excellent, right? Different points in our lives. That's very true, right? A 20-year-old young man trying to control his libido is going to be easier than, say, a 80-year-old man, depending on the 80-year-old, but most of them is going to be easier for that person to control it versus, for example, maybe anger or thought or something like that. That's a very good point too. So we can make an argument for all of them, and it might differ individual to individual, culture to culture, era to era, and point of life, or we should say life stage to life stage, depending on your age. Let's now hear what our author says. Raghib al-Asfahani, he is of the opinion that urge is the most difficult one to tame and to master. Hear him out. Why does he say that? He says, first of all, because urge is tied most immediately to the preservation of self and preservation of the species. He's talking about our two greatest needs. Our need to eat, right? Which is also part of urge. We said most urge is talking about food and sex. That's basically what we're getting at there. Could be other things, but those are the big ones. So the food part addresses a very, very immediate fundamental need of ours as human beings, which is that anybody who doesn't eat for 2 or 3 days, they are going to be irritable. They are going to be emotionally unstable. They are going to be in a very, 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 their physiology is going to change. They're going to be in a very difficult situation, right? So eating food is immediately, most immediately, more than, say, getting angry, more than even thought, is most immediately tied to our survival. Okay? Our anger, we rely upon our anger to fend off intruders or enemies or things like that. But how often are we utilizing that kind of capacity for our survival? Not as often. The same with thought, right? We use it maybe more often than anger for our survival. However, it's not as immediate as our need for food. As for reproduction, then it is something that is completely overwhelming, right, to the human body. Like it is something at a hormonal level that takes over, that conquers. And our sense of continuity of species, whether our family keeps going or not, depends upon the satisfaction or the utilization of this capacity, right? One could also say, and I can only speak from the experience of a man, but I think perhaps most of the men will agree with me that the frequency of the urge, or the frequency of being called to use that capacity, is right up there with food, depending, maybe a little lower for some, maybe a little higher for some, who knows. But it's right up there in its immediacy, right? Whereas anger and thought, at least anger especially, tends to be a reactive thing to something else that's happening. And the urge for food and offspring can also be reactive, but even if you subtract all stimulants or stimuli, it's going to happen anyway. It's going to keep coming up, whether there's something provoking it or not. So that's his first argument. His second is because you can find urge in both man and the animal kingdom. So it's not like thought, for example, where it's something that is a little bit more specifically human. Not to say that animals can't think, but that human beings disproportionately rely on the capacity of thought, perhaps, from what we know, from what we can observe, more than much of, if not all of, the animal kingdom. As for anger, it would be debatable in the first place whether, for example, a predator experiences anger when it's hunting prey. Either way, we can confidently observe that the prey can't be said to be really experiencing anger. It more experiences fear, which is what causes it to survive. Right? So we're looking for survival mechanisms, and we see thought comes up with some creatures and doesn't come up with others, and anger comes up with some creatures and doesn't come up with others. However, the urge, the capacity of urge for food and offspring, they cut across all creatures, not just humans and animals, even plants. Even plants turn towards the sun, right, in the daytime in order to get more food. They will go to seed if they're stressed quickly in order to reproduce, right? So Raghib Asfahani, he's getting philosophical on us. He's saying that that it cuts across all beings is proof that it's more immediate and more fundamental. And his last evidence, so he's got three proofs. Those are his first two. The third one, he says, is that utilizing this capacity, urge, is more immediately enjoyable and rewarding than utilizing the other capacities. You can't say that utilizing anger gives you a reward per se, right? If you successfully kind of like repel a threat, there might be some sort of satisfaction there. But it's not the same when it comes to food or offspring, right? The libido, to satisfy it is extremely rewarding immediately. The same thing with thought. There might be some of us who can read books and like the moments, the eureka moments of insight are some of the best moments of our lives that we live for, that are extremely inspirational. But how often do those moments come when the capacity for thought is used? Whereas with satisfying food and libido, it's pretty much every single time. You're utilizing that capacity, it's reward, 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 which is why, going back to his example of domesticating animals, if you want to domesticate or train an animal, what do you use? You use food. scientific experiments. If they want to conduct experiments, and this is controversial even in the Shariah, whether this is permissible or not, depending on the harm that's associated with the harm that is might potentially befall animals like lab rats or things like that, or lab mice. But what do researchers use in these experiments? They use reward, and the reward is food almost always. So that's the three-pronged argument of our author to back his opinion that the urge is the most immediate, strongest capacity that we have, and therefore the hardest to tame and to discipline. Indeed, he says that managing this particular urge is the difference between man and animal. Not thought, because you can find animals like dolphins and chimpanzees and others that also have some degree of thought, and it's quite impressive, honestly. Crows, ravens, the jay family, these sorts of things. And you find anger elsewhere. But being able to control urge is something the author is asserting that only human beings are capable of doing. To need to eat, but to refrain. To want to satisfy the libido, but to abstain. Raghib al-Asfahani is saying that is what makes a human, is the ability to withhold or refrain from that capacity, or to master it or discipline it. The stakes are extremely high, as he says. He says this particular capacity, more so than thought, more so than anger, if left unchecked, if left to run wild, it will turn the person into its slave. The person becomes the slave of food and the slave of his libido. He is conquered by it. It's as if he's just an automaton. He can't do anything of his own accord. And this is precisely how the devil most commonly attempts to persuade us or manipulate us to get ourselves in trouble, to make us commit sin. Does he use our anger? Yes, he does. Does he use our thought? Yes, he does. But more often and more frequently, he leverages against us something that we desire too much or something that we fear too much. When you want something urge-wise, whether it's food, whether it's sex, romance, it doesn't have to be, like whatever, like carnal, like romance, like a relationship, companionship. If you want it too much, the devil will leverage that against you in order to disobey Allah. Majority of people who go to magicians and utilize magic, why do they do it? Relationships and trying to have children, by far. Just as the devil will take something that you fear a little too much and he will threaten you with it in order to get you to disobey Allah, even just in your heart. Because there's different types of disobedience. You could disobey Allah by performing an action that disobeys his Shariah or violates his Tawheed. Or you could do an action of the heart, like doubting Allah's ability to take care of everything, doubting Allah's ability to forgive you, doubting Allah's mercy, not trusting that Allah is capable of all things. So if we leave the urge unchecked, it becomes our master, which is the meaning of Allah's statement that He has not created in the chest of man two hearts. It's not possible to worship this and Allah. Either you're slave to your urges or you're a slave to Allah. And being a proper slave to Allah necessitates the taming and disciplining of those urges so that they are not your master. Vice versa, if we embark upon the journey of taming this capacity, our urge, then this is liberation, if there is such a thing on earth. Which is the irony of the time period that we live in. The irony of the time period that we live in. Every corner, from the media to corporations to education, is telling us that liberation comes through indulging in our urges, doing it whatever it is we want, and freedom comes from removing all obstacles to the thing that we really want. Raghib al-Asfahani saying exactly the opposite. Once you tame what you want, once you discipline your urge, once you train yourself upon abstention, abstinence, refrain, restraint, that is freedom. That is actual liberation. If you're able to tame yourself like this and to manage this capacity, then your needs lessen. And if your needs lessen, no one can control you. The devil can't control you. Other people can't control you. You become self-sufficient. You become independent. You become generous with what you have. And therefore you become noble. This is the meaning of the Prophet's statement. Izhad fi dunya yuhibbuk Allah. Wazhad fima inda nas yuhibbuk nas. Refrain from that which is in the world and Allah will love you. And refrain from that which belongs to other people and those people will love you too. If this capacity, urge, food, appetite, libido, desire, is so dangerous that it can enslave us, why did Allah create it or create us with it in the first place? Isn't it setting us up to fail? Isn't it stacking the deck against us? We're getting short on time, so I'll tell you what our author says. Aywa, Sheikh family, mashallah, put it very succinctly. He says, moderation can be worship. And that's precisely it. Raghib al-Asfahani, he says that urge is only bad and only evil and only your master if you allow it to fall into either of the excesses, if it is neglected and it takes control. However, if it is tamed and trained, it leads to that liberation, it leads to that happiness, and this is a means to paradise. This has to do with converting our urges and our habits into worship. Eating, which is a necessity, which you have to do, something that is so potentially conquering over you, can become worship if you do it in the way that Allah loves and have the proper intention. The same with your romantic life. The same with satisfying your libido. It can be worship if it's done with the proper person, meaning within the context of marriage, and it has the proper intention. Raghib al-Asfahani, he says that worship, all worship, is predicated upon this worldly life because it has to do with it always has an element of sacrificing something of the dunya. Even when we leave to pray, there's an opportunity cost that's involved. We could have been clocking more hours. We could have been having more fun. We could have been doing something else. But no, we've taken the investment to go leave and pray. And so instead we're going to do that. So worship has this inherent relationship with this worldly life. Every act of worship is a trade-off from our portion of the worldly life. And the worldly life itself is predicated upon preserving our bodies. Preserving our bodies is predicated upon returning repeatedly to the things that give life, such as food, such as intimacy. And there is nothing more efficient to call us back to returning to these things than the urge that Allah has created in us, as He says in Surah Al-Imran, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ. Allah says it Himself, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ. It has been beautified to people, حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ, love of these sorts of urges and desires. So it's all there for a purpose. Allah placed it there like diamonds in the rough, ready for you to grab, to polish off, and to say, hey, look, this is now in my possession, it's in my bank account. It's going to count for me. And think about the massive waste of most people's lives when they're just living and they're eating and they're eating and they're being intimate with their spouse and Allah knows who else. And none of it counts for anything. It's all just wasted time, or even worse, against them, when all of that which they had to do anyway could have all been worshiping their Creator and putting up something, saving up something for tomorrow. So Raghib al-Asfahani, he ends the chapter by saying that urge is like an enemy that you fear its harm, but you depend upon him in another way. He's like the enemy of your enemy. He's not your friend, but you rely upon him to keep your other enemy in check, and you have hope that he does this work, but you're also afraid to get too close to him at the same time. It's like you can't do it with him, but you can't do it without him. So he says the intellect has to tread very, very carefully. The human being has to walk on eggshells to use the urge purposefully and with benefit, but not to get too comfortable with it, not to overdo it or rely on it too much so that it gains powerful over you. And he references a line of poetry from Al-Mutanabbi, and it's really, really nice for those of you who speak Arabic or like Arabic literature. وَمِن نَكْتِ الدُّنْيَا عَلَى الْحُرِّ أَنْ يَرَى عَدُوًا لَهُ مَا مِنْ صَدَاقَتِهِ بُدُّ. So he compares it to like he compares your dunya to like a bride paying the dowry of which there's no escape. It's like paying dowry to an enemy, but there's no way around it. And the last thing that he says, and we'll close with this because we're just about out of time, is that all the urges that we experience in this life, this is actually a preview of the pleasures of Jannah. And so as delicious and excellent as they are in this life, that is meant to be a motivation for us to pursue them in the next life. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Thank you very much, everybody. Any last questions before we get shut off here? This book is not available in English.
I got a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if we got time to answer it though.
Shoot it.
So what's the difference between urge and nafs then? Yeah. Like isn't that the nafs, isn't it your nafs urging something or whatever?